So, this lecture is going to talk about some of the events associated with the First Crusade. And even the use of that term is a little misleading because, as we'll see, there are actually sort of three different contingents of people, varying degrees of armed, who set out after Urban's speech and attempt to reach Jerusalem to sort of fulfill a vow to liberate the Holy Land. And so this is the first of three, the People's Crusade. So we'll talk more about Urban's vision, and this is sort of a fairly contemporary manuscript depiction of him sort of traveling to Clermont and then preaching. And we know, based on the accounts of Urban's speech, and the first sort of major speech to hit the radar of folk happened in Clermont, France, but then he continues around to other places. And so this message has a number of sort of elements to it. The first is to assist the Byzantine Emperor Alexius in recovering lost territory. And we do know that a few years prior to the Council of Clermont in 1095, Alexius did contact Urban and say, hey, can you come help me? And even though the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church were sort of at odds, this was seen as maybe an opportunity to breach that gap. The other sort of item on his agenda was, and this is the most compelling, to establish a permanent Christian presence in the Levant, particularly to take over Jerusalem. And obviously they couch this in terms of reconquering Jerusalem, connecting way back to that sort of very early Christian past. But that does seem to be one of Urban's main goals, to make it safe for pilgrims because of these rumors about desecration of holy sites, and also just what he thought it to be fitting that Christians should control Jerusalem because of its centrality in sort of the Christian spiritual conceptions. His target audience were knights. Militi Christi is what they were sometimes called. Knights of Christ. And he was talking about people who had money, who had resources, and more importantly, had the military skills to actually undertake this endeavor. He did not think this was going to be a peaceful takeover of Jerusalem. He knew they would encounter resistance. So he tells them, okay, it's 1095, you go home, you spend the next few months making preparations, raising funds, filling out your wills, which is what a lot of them do, and getting ready for this departure. So let's all plan to meet on August 15th of the following year in Constantinople. So in terms of sort of the response to this, it really seems to have exceeded Urban's expectations. Not only does he get this sort of overwhelming outcry of support from the nobles who he was targeting, but there are a number of just average people, peasants, middle class burghers who respond as well. And this seems to be, this is one of those moments that's really hard to explain exactly what he tapped into. But it seems to be stemming from this idea of Gregorian reform, reforming the church, peace and truce of God, people thinking a little bit more sort of in a more focused manner about sort of spiritual endeavors. Also within the nobility, this is a moment when you have a lot of instability. Obviously, we saw with the peace and truce of God, violence within Western society had become sort of rampant. And so some nobles did see this as an opportunity for secular gain. What seems to be more prevalent, at least in the accounts we have of sort of the People's Crusade, is more of this real spiritual conviction that the day of judgment is imminent, that they are really sort of on the verge of the second coming, and that it's essential for Christians to be in control of Jerusalem when that happens. And then returning to sort of the secular notion, you do see this sort of resurgence of Byzantine forces, of sort of the Byzantine Empire managing to kind of reestablish this connection to the West. This is one of the few depictions we have of the individual who sort of led the People's Crusade, and that's Peter the Hermit. And one of the things that this image really does illustrate While we do know that a lot of his followers were sort of non-combatants, they were women, in some instances they were children, they were peasant men, they were older people, he does have a smattering of knights and of armed followers that he's sort of leading. So who was Peter the Hermit, the guy who's responsible for this sort of arm of the First Crusade? We know that he was from Amiens in France. He was sort of a local celebrity in terms of sort of his reputation for piety and for just sort of being extremely sort of penitent. He was described by sources as wearing nothing but a woolen shirt over a mantle. His arms and feet were always bare. You can see his head was tonsured in the fashion of a monk, though we do not know that he was a member of any monastic community, hence the name hermit, so someone sort of living in isolation. And we also have accounts that he ate nothing but wine and fish. He never ate bread. So sort of an indication of his abstinence, of the extent to which he followed this very austere lifestyle. And we know that he sort of took it upon himself, after hearing the Pope's message at Clermont, to preach the crusade. He sort of targeted audiences then of sort of peasants, of villages, moving from town to town in southern France and Germany. He did have a few sort of mid-level knights, I'll call them, in his entourage. One was Walter Sans-Avoir, which the French translates as Walter the Penniless, but he probably wasn't penniless. He was just a little bit lower down on the noble scale. And then there's a German nobleman who he eventually encounters named Amico, and you'll see a lot of different variations of that spelling in the sources. So as he moves through France and the Rhineland, he attracts and accumulates these followers. And they eventually arrive at Cologne in the Rhineland in April of 1096, so on Easter. So what could have possibly motivated these average individuals, these agricultural workers, these peasants, these people from the towns, to literally, according to sort of eyewitness accounts, drop everything they had and just sort of pack up what they could carry in a small bag and follow Peter to Jerusalem? We know that on the eve of the Crusades, there was a series of sort of very challenging events. So 1094 marked sort of flood and famine, very poor harvests. You have 1095, this time you have drought and famine, and so another series of harvests, back-to-back harvest failures, absolutely devastating for people living in this subsistence level. And so in a lot of the natural sort of response when people are encountering these just really, really challenging conditions is to look to God. So what's happening? Why is God mad? Clearly we're being punished for something. You also have around this time a series of meteor showers that show up in the annals. Obviously we know that this is just sort of standard meteorological patterns, but you can imagine how people in the Middle Ages would have responded to something like this, which would have been very, very visible in the night sky. This is not a meteor shower. This is a depiction from the Bayeux Tapestry, which is an embroidered tapestry that tells the story of the invasion of the Norman conquest. But one of the sort of omens that they point to during that time, so this is 30 years earlier, is this comet. And you can see right above that second structure, like this thing sort of zooming through the sky with the round circle and the tail. That was actually Halley's Comet. So this is one of the first historical records we have of the appearance of Halley's Comet. But these sorts of phenomena that would have occurred, they really did sort of interpret it either in a positive way, depending on what happened next, or in a negative way. So for these people, this was a pilgrimage. They were going to expiate their sins. They were preparing for Judgment Day, which they thought was right around the corner. Peter was very, very effective in raising money. So as he would go on these preaching tours, he would ask people who weren't going for donations. So at least early on, he was able to buy most of the supplies and the food and just sort of the fundamental basics that these people needed, at least until they got to Cologne. So they arrive in Cologne on Easter. They leave on Assumption Day. this is when you have a division of this large group. Amico and a couple other mid-level nobles are going to remain behind, and we'll pick up their story next. So we know from accounts, these may have, like, the contemporary accounts say things like multitudes and more than an eye can count, but some sources allow us to estimate probably about 20,000 men, women, and children are sort of walking through the countryside following Peter along this trade route from Cologne to Constantinople. And so they have these wagons of money and of supplies, donations, things they've been able to purchase. Obviously, this is a very slow moving group. They cover about 25 miles a day, which is actually pretty extraordinary if you think about what that means. But it's a really long way to Jerusalem. So at that pace, it's going to take them quite a while. This is another contemporary depiction of Peter. So the process is initially fairly smooth, mostly support from local communities, in part because they don't interact with the local communities except for Peter's preaching. But we do know that things start to deteriorate. So in May, they enter the Kingdom of Hungary, and this is when we start to see some issues. So there's a small contingent of knights under Walter Sons of War who, for some reason or another, when the rest of the group moves on, they stay back in the sort of border town of Semlin. And we know that they're robbed by some local Hungarians. And so some of the knights come back. There's a military encounter with the local Hungarians, and it does not go well for the Crusaders. So we know that they lose about 4,000 men on that occasion. Next month in June, they're in Belgrade. Again, they run into some problems with some of the local communities. A lot of these local communities don't really know what this group of people is doing. They don't understand their intentions. And in particular, you're still recovering from those years of famine and harvest failures. So no one is actually flush in terms of food stock. And so the local communities of Belgrade say, we can't sell you any food because we don't have enough for ourselves. And so that results in some local plundering and some raiding. We know in one instance, a group of Peter's followers plundered some stockpiles in a local town. They were rounded up and trapped in a church, and about 60 of them were burned to death. Eventually, however, Peter manages to get this group to Constantinople. Again, you do have skirmishes with some of the local villagers who object to sort of the pillaging or aren't willing to sell to the Crusaders, and that results in some hostility. And so the Emperor Alexios sort of meets Peter. He's very impressed by Peter himself. He's heard stories of Peter's reputation as a preacher, of this man who can sort of command the attention of all of these people who are following him. But when he sees the people that Peter has brought to help him defeat the Muslims, he's not exactly impressed. This is not what he meant. He meant sort of a real armed force, not all these non-combatants that not only can't fight, but require protection themselves. So what he says to Peter is, look, not good for you to stay here in the outskirts of Constantinople, so I'm going to arrange some ships, have you go across the Bosporus, which is that little stretch of water that separates Constantinople from Asia Minor. I'm going to get you across. There is a fortress that I still control, and you can sort of stay there until the rest of the Crusaders arrive. So during this final stage, this is the manuscript image of the fortress of Kivito, where they end up staying. This is still Byzantine controlled, but what Alexios says to Peter is, look, don't go too far from Kivito because that's Turkish territory and you don't want to go there. And gradually, though, what we start to see is as they sort of wait for several months, waiting for the rest of the Crusader armies to arrive, there's a lot of restlessness amongst the people. We start to see some local raiding. So there's a contingent of French who are following Peter. They're sacking local villages. They probably do start to see a decline in their supplies and their resources. And so they're resorting to plunder. We also hear stories. So you don't just have Muslims in this area, right? You have a lot of different Christian groups. You have Greek Orthodox Christians, you have Armenian Christians, you have Nestorian Christians, you have Monophysite Christians. Like, you have a ton of different Christians. But from a Roman Orthodox perspective, they're not the right kind of Christians. So we hear stories of torture of local Christians, accusations. Why do you cooperate with these Muslims? They're supposed to be our enemy. And increasingly, Peter loses control of this sort of ragtag group of followers. And he eventually goes back to Constantinople to request additional help from Alexios in terms of supplies. However, while he's gone, things continue to deteriorate. In September, a German contingent attacks a nearby Turkish-held fortress of Zeragordon. They surround the fortress for 8 days, but they do not understand the topography of this territory, and they underestimate the need for water and to have sort of a reliable, dependable source of water. So they eventually run out of water, and then a Turkish army shows up. They surrender. The Germans are forced to they surround the Germans. The Germans are forced to surrender, and many of them are killed in the skirmishes, and most of them are enslaved, and they disappear from the historical record. So Peter hears this story. He sort of ratchets up his pleas for aid from Alexios. He plans to return, but before that, in October, sort of the remaining group of Peter's followers, because there is no sort of leader in the moment, decide to march for the city of Nicaea, which is also Byzantine controlled, but they think that there'll be more supplies there because they're running out of supplies in Kivito. And so this group is ambushed by local Turks. Many of them are massacred. Those who survive are enslaved. A few stragglers return to Constantinople, where Alexios says, okay, just stop and go home. This is not going to happen for you. And it seems as if some of them, probably the few knights who remain, are absorbed by the Crusader armies that arrive, but most of the non-combatants who've survived this do seem to have somehow made their way home. Unfortunately, this arm of the First Crusade is not as well documented as those that come later. So we have sort of brief snippets of the outcome, but not very much. We do know that Peter survives, and he stays in Constantinople, and he does sort of join up with the rest of the army that's going to arrive shortly later.